Welcome to Drilling into Crypto. I'm your host, Mohammed El Masri. Every week I speak to the leaders that are driving the global financial revolution. Drilling into Crypto puts the spotlight on the importance of crypto assets, on energy markets, and on global monetary policy. In today's episode, we've got Janine Moir, the National Digital Assurance Leader at Deloitte. Janine is also a founding member of the Canadian Blockchain Association for Women, a board member of the Canadian Blockchain Consortium, and a board member for the Horizon Housing Society. Janine is a CPA, CA with over 15 years of experience providing advisory and assurance services. She loves bringing this expertise and experience to her clients, and today she's bringing it to us on Drilling into Crypto. Without further ado, Janine, tell us about yourself. Tell us more about Janine, your background, and how you got into crypto and digital assets.
Sure. Well, certainly my background's probably different than what you would maybe traditionally expect to be in blockchain, but I guess, I'll talk about my interest in it, and then I'll talk a little bit about my education and background after that. But I grew up super nerdy compared to most people. So growing up in Calgary, you'd think that my family would have been in oil and gas just because that's the typical stereotype, right? Mine wasn't at all. My dad actually was in tech, and he had a company called Rights Market back in the day, which basically is digital rights management, and pretty much his ideas everybody uses today, but too early, wrong place, wrong time kind of thing. And so he had multiple software companies that were either trying to solve royalty rights management, which you see starting to try and happen in crypto and in the blockchain space. And, he worked for Oracle, and I remember we had the first laptop ever. So I grew up having access to computers, internet before, honestly, probably anyone I knew. I taught myself a little bit of coding, like just HTML, nothing crazy when I was younger, but needless to say, I've always leaned towards tech just because that's the way that I grew up. So that's a background for having at least a bit of a skill set to understand it is, start on DOS, work my way all through. But where it kind of converged for me was the fact that I've always been a big science fiction reader, huge science fiction nerd. And if there's one consistent theme that I saw across all of the science fiction I was reading is that we either had credits, we had digital money. There was, often resistance against some kind of centralized government and people wanting to spend digital money. So that was in my mind from a very young age that this was the way that the trajectory of money was going to go, or value exchange. And so when I learned about Bitcoin, and I can't say that I came to Bitcoin super early on, like, I don't know, maybe it was like 2015, something like that. But it just clicked immediately for me. And I was like, oh, okay, like it completely makes sense. I didn't know what the technology was going to be to get us there. And science fiction has an enormous predictive factor for the world. And some of the biggest inventions in the world have been from science fiction. So the Kindle, that's from science fiction. There's all kinds of like our digital assistants that are from science fiction. And so to me, it just made a ton of sense. And I was kind of waiting to see how that would necessarily tie in with my own background, which if I talk about my actual educational and experience background, I'm a CA, CPA, like a chartered accountant with an audit background. And when I was in industry, I worked as a manager of financial reporting and like a controller. So very much, all the AR, AP, any of, financial reports, transactions, lots of, I did work in oil and gas for a while. So lots of multi-party agreements that frankly would be perfectly suited for blockchain, right? Because you have multiple people needing access to the same details, right? Like it makes so much sense for blockchain. So once I kind of saw the light with Bitcoin and blockchain, I just threw myself into it completely. And there's a pretty big scene of people in Calgary who are into the blockchain space, some enterprise and a ton of digital assets. And I just really, no one else was there, like from a from a consulting or a firm perspective. And I told my boss, I'm like, we have to be here. I just told him, I'm like, we have to be here. And, he's awesome. And he was just like, I don't really know what this thing is yet, but you get it and you're super passionate about it and go for it. And so that's actually how it started for me at work, was to slowly build up the case for why companies need people with a knowledge skill set like mine, plus, my traditional accounting and audit background, to be able to bring those two things together. So that's kind of a long background, but that is how I got into the space.
Well, it makes sense. Your tech background and your tech upbringing is a perfect fit. And the fact that you bring up, the oil and gas sector and in general, the energy sector is looking at blockchain in a totally different perspective than they were looking at it maybe 2 years ago. And it's becoming much more adopted by very large energy companies, whether in different countries and different regions, whether national or private. And it's slowly surfacing, whether it's from the energy use or whether it's from the administrative side or back office and data analytics. So there's a lot there that can provide value to the entire energy supply chain, right? Or energy production phases from upstream to midstream to downstream. And it's interesting to see how blockchain is unfolding in that sector. And what is your experience in the oil and gas? Have you seen oil and gas companies adopt blockchain internally at such a level or at large scale?
Yep. So there's definitely a few of the super majors who have adopted. One of them they're an Ethereum shop, for example. So that's what we're going to do it on. And some of the solutions in this space, were built on other things like Corda or Hyperledger. So it really depended what your ethos was for your company. I've seen, when we think of the concept of blockchain, you'll have people who are super maximalist when it comes to Bitcoin and the open network side. And then you'll obviously have people who believe there's multiple use cases. And what I've seen a lot of the larger companies do, which isn't super unusual, is they want to experiment with an internal blockchain yet. You know what I mean? And that may not make sense to a lot of us who quote get it, but it's getting themselves comfortable with how it can work. And for a lot of the oil and gas companies, I found that there's a provenance aspect for them. And you could do that between disparate systems that you have internally, and then you could bring it out to your partners. So the most successful that I've seen, though, is OOC in Houston, where there's a bunch of super majors and majors who've all gotten together. They're actually using a friend of mine's software, Guild One. So James Graham's been doing a bunch of work with them. And so again, that was the hardest part about permissioned blockchains and consortiums, is actually getting people together and to agree, right? So that's the most success I've really seen in blockchain for oil and gas companies so far. That's public. But one of the other things that I find is that people don't necessarily want to say what they're doing just yet. So I've seen things like fuel quality traceability, AFE between partners. So having different sign-offs happen, whereas like, I don't know how much you had to work in maybe a land or a JV department, but you actually have to run around stuff within 30 days by registered mail. You can have it done in seconds. So there's things like that are honestly, that's more operational efficiency, but it is still that distribution of information around the parties that need to see it. And frankly, the public doesn't need to see who elected to participate in a well or not. That's not their business. However, there's this big existential debate, I would say, everywhere, which is, when I think of Ethereum, I kind of think of it as somewhat like because there's so many applications written on it, right? There's just so many that in a way it's coming part of a like information backbone almost. Like if you want to think of the internet, everything's kind of the internet was all built on a language. Well, maybe Ethereum is going to be that language, and there's going to be all kinds of new innovations where, if you're really on the public side and you're kind of far off to that direction, you believe that everything can be done by a zero knowledge proof, and literally everything can be public, including private corporation information. That's obviously a leap for people who are used to completely permission systems. And the thing I always think about when I'm talking to clients is, well, even if you could do it one way or the other, what does your business need? Like, why? Why are you doing this? And you shouldn't do blockchain, period, if you have no need to be on blockchain. And I think that's one of the issues in the space, is that people want to blockchain something. It's like, that could just be a database. Right? Like that's kind of one of the number one things that happens. So, and I think that's why you see a lot more innovation and very interesting things happening in the digital asset space, because non-fungible tokens, we've got smart contracts, we've got DeFi, like we've got all these things that all of a sudden have reasons to take data from public sources and that people should see. So it's just really
I'd like
cool
to start seeing the NFT concept applied on natural resources as it's unfolding right now. I mean, people are looking at the tokenization process as a way to whether access new form of capital or new liquidity pools for the energy sector or the natural resources sectors. And tokenization of those natural resources could go a long way, and the energy industry needs to innovate eventually, but in what direction is it going to innovate is the major challenge, I think, because there are a lot of legacy systems that are tough to just not consider at this point. You have to change your entire operations.
I think there's some interesting ideas, though. I mean, especially actually in Alberta being I think we're the only deregulated, for example, electricity market in the country. So when you think of power generation and tokenizing of that power being generated, whether it's to prove like a carbon credit, let's say it's from solar, okay, because you can actually go to that one sensor or that one field and say, this is what's generated here. And then you can actually create new markets for that. I mean, I think of things like carbon capture. If you can, prove that what you're actually doing, maybe you didn't flare it and you didn't do whatever, and you're wanting to get some kind of credit for what you've done, creating some kind of token that can be monetized or at least just shared with the public to prove what you're doing. However, we always come back to the main issue of garbage in and garbage out on a blockchain. So actually, I think that's an important distinction for people. A lot of people I talk to are just like, well, it's on blockchain, so it's right. I'm like, not even a little bit, right? Like we can all say and agree that the sky is green and everybody votes for it. And all of a sudden that's on the blockchain for forever. So that actually maybe transitions a little bit into around my background, because for me, it's a huge issue. Do you have proper controls around the information flows off and on your chain? So off and on ramps. What are your off-chain transactions? What are the ways you're storing your information off-chain? And then do people actually understand what they're doing and how it affects the end information? So I do actually spend a lot of time thinking about those sorts of things.
That's a perfect segue to my next question. There are systems and controls that need to be put in place before someone starts applying or adopting blockchain technology or any other technology for that matter. You have to have the right systems and controls in place. And when you're doing a regulated or non-regulated activity, you have to have different types of or different standards of systems and controls in place, and different policies and different procedures. Generally speaking, what are the systems and controls that someone or a company needs to consider before applying and adopting blockchain into their business model